talk also marks the first of a series of talks that we're going to have interspersed throughout the winter and spring quarters with a focus on climate change. And here with us today is Dr. Emily Lindsey. Emily Lindsey is an assistant curator and excavation site director at the Tar Pits here in Los Angeles. And she's also adjunct faculty in the Institute of Environment and Sustainability at UCLA. And I learned from her today, I was very curious to know where the offices were at the Tar Pits. And you actually go into the Page Museum and then go underground to find the location where they're all busy doing their work. And I also learned that people, when they visit the Tar Pits from out of town, think that the scientists in the excavation is all actors and like amusement park style, not actually real scientists in excavations, which was kind of a fun little interesting little tidbit of knowledge. Okay, so Emily is here today to present her talk, Dawn of the Anthropocene, How Humans and a Warming Climate Drove Pleistocene Mammal Extinctions and Reshaped California's Landscape. We have about an hour for the talk and Q&A, and then we have a little break at 1. People can get coffee, and then we have a little bit more of an in-depth conversation with Emily for those of you who can stick around. So please join me in welcoming Emily today. Thank you.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. I guess we can't make it too much darker in here, but maybe like if we could turn off the lights. Let's see. Oh, that's better. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Well, yeah, so thanks so much for inviting me. I always love speaking to audiences outside of paleontology and the earth sciences. I really a lot of what I do overlaps with archaeology, and I love working with archaeologists and anthropologists and stuff, so I'm really interested to hear kind of your group's feedback on this research that we've been working on just down the road. So it's been recognized for a long time that the world that we are living in today, the ecosystems we're living in today, are substantially different from what they have been for most of Earth's history. So back in the 1870s, Alfred Russel Wallace, who was a contemporary of Charles Darwin, noted, "We live in a zoologically impoverished world from which all the hugest and fiercest and strangest forms have recently disappeared." And as an example of this, here in North America, these silhouettes represent large mammals that were present on the landscape around the peak of the last ice age, let's say about 25,000 years ago. And the green ones on the bottom are the only ones that are still around today. More than 70% of the large mammal fauna in North America went extinct relatively recently, just over, let's say, about 10,000 years ago. And this is a pattern that we see repeated around the world. It's not just a North American phenomenon. In South America, more than 80% of mammals weighing over 100 pounds went extinct. In northern Eurasia, more than 60% went extinct. In Australia, almost 90% went extinct. So this is a pattern that we see repeated across the world within a relatively constrained period of time. And this isn't just a difference between the Pleistocene and the Holocene. This is a difference between the Holocene, or the time we're living in today, and what has been the norm for our planet for about the last 50 to 60 million years. So in other words, ever since a big asteroid slammed into the Yucatan Peninsula, wiped out all the dinosaurs, this allowed, that happened about 66 million years ago, and that opened up all this ecospace for these little guys, the mammals, to start to evolve and radiate and take off. And so ever since then, most of Earth's ecosystems have looked something like this. There have been a lot of large mammals in all ecosystems on the planet for at least the last 50 million years. In fact, one way to think of it is the African savanna, sort of, that we can see in a few isolated national parks and wildlife refuges in Africa today. This is the closest thing we have to a normal Cenozoic ecosystem left on this planet. This extinction, it wasn't just sort of an agnostic, random selection of animals that went extinct. It was very size selective. It really focused on the big guys. So for instance, at the Liberia tar pits down the road, we have fossils from 5 large cat species, mountain lions, which are still around today. We have Pleistocene jaguars. We have 2 species of saber-toothed cats. We have the American lions, which were the biggest cats that ever lived. They came up to about my shoulder. Terrifying creatures. And of course, the only ones that survive to this day are the smallest and most generalist of these creatures, which are the mountain lions. And this is really important because megafauna, or big animals, big mammals in this case, are really important for the functioning of ecosystems. It's not just like, oh, we have the exact same ecosystem, we just don't have the big things in it. When you lose the big animals from an ecosystem, you change all kinds of things about that ecosystem. So you have differences, of course, in plant communities that these large animals are controlling through herbivory and trampling. This cascades to other smaller animals that rely on these plant communities. You have changes in the interactions between plants and animals, pollinators and pollinated plants, all kinds of things. You have often increases in parasite load. You have changes in nutrient cycling. You have changes in fire regime, which is something we'll get to later. So taking out large mammals has really outsized impacts on ecosystems. And a way to illustrate this, just sort of visually, is here are 4 different ecosystems with and without large, in this case, predator or large animals in them. So the Aleutian Islands with Arctic foxes, and with the Arctic foxes removed. Same place, completely different habitat type. Yellowstone National Park, we all know what happened when wolves were reintroduced to Yellowstone National Park. You go from having this sort of ecosystem that's really grazed to the ground by elk to this. The elk populations are depressed, their behavior's impacted, that allows plants to flourish, that has cascading impacts on things like not only small animals that eat and live in vegetation, but everything down to erosion and stream function and fish. Neotropical forests, these are forests in Venezuela, I believe, with and without jaguars. And on the African Serengeti, we know when elephants and wildebeest are extinct or are extirpated, excluded from ecosystems, you go very rapidly from this sort of open savanna ecosystem with a few shrubs to this very dense thicket kind of ecosystem just by getting rid of, in this case, just wildebeest, just one species of large mammal. You completely change that because suddenly you don't have these massive herds of large mammals that are going through, uprooting bushes, trampling everything, maintaining these open spaces, which are really important. These open mosaic habitats are really important for maintaining biodiversity. And one thing that happens in that situation is you get a very rapid change in fire regime. You have much more frequent and much more severe fires because suddenly you have all this woody vegetation to burn. So to sum up, the Ice Age, or Pleistocene extinctions, were a global phenomenon that wiped out about 2/3 of the large mammals on the planet in a very short period of time. This represents the biggest extinction event since the dinosaurs, 65 million years ago. It has come to be recognized as probably the initial pulse in the biodiversity crisis that we are going through today. And yet, despite the importance and relative recent time of this extinction event, the causes are still relatively poorly understood and really intensely debated by scientists and have been for the last 70 years. And there's a couple of reasons for this. So one of the reasons is that there were 2 things happening at this time, and they were happening very rapidly. So one of the things that was happening, of course, is we're coming out of the Ice Age, right? So we go from a point 20,000 years ago where half of North America is under as much as 3 miles of ice to the North America we're living in today, right? So it's very rapid warming. And we know that, these large-scale climate changes can have big impacts on animal communities. You can sort of change, you can constrict potential range. You change, of course, the habitat which these animals rely on for food and shelter. There was also this sort of surprising reversal where it was warming rapidly and then it got cold very rapidly and then it warmed again. And that's even been proposed by some scientists that, well, maybe there was something else going on, like a comet explosion that caused this and had other impacts. That's mostly been debunked, but it's still out there. And of course, we know that, climate change is imperiling all kinds of plants and animals and even whole ecosystems today. So it's not much of a stretch to think that large-scale climate change could have been a major factor in these extinctions. And in fact, with the exception of the dinosaur extinction, which was actually caused by a meteor, every other mass extinction in Earth's history has been related to rapid, severe climate change. Now, of course, the other thing that's happening at this time, which is closer to your realm, is that humans were rapidly growing in population size and spreading out around the world. And scientists have noted for a long time that the extinctions on different continents tend to correlate pretty closely with the arrival of humans. These extinctions have often been hypothesized to be tied to human hunting of megafauna, but there are also other indirect impacts that humans can have on ecosystems, like habitat fragmentation and setting fires. And of course, we have evidence in the past as well as in very recent history of humans having really devastating impacts on ecosystems and large mammals in particular. And so it's not much of a stretch to think that humans might have played a very significant role in these extinctions. Now, interestingly, on the research side, the studies of extinctions tend to fall out along different lines of hypothesized impacts based on the scale of the study. So large-scale studies where paleontologists and archaeologists are using big global or multi-continental data sets have tended to conclude that these extinctions were largely caused by humans and didn't have much to do with climate change. On the other hand, there's a lot of local scale studies based on single sites or very restricted regions where scientists have concluded just the opposite. They see the disappearance of large animals happening in conjunction with climate changes and before any evidence of human occupation in the region. So you have sort of this dichotomy of scientists that are working at very local sort of site-specific scales, periodically finding disappearance related to climate and not humans, whereas scientists looking at these very zoomed out global scales, finding the extinctions being related to humans and not climate. Now, of course, we know that today, both of these things are causing extinctions, right? And in some cases, it's two of these things together. So for instance, if we go back to our remaining Cenozoic ecosystem, the African savanna, we know that a lot of these animal species and their habitats are threatened by climate change. Now, in the past, let's say 100,000 years ago, when the climate changed, large mammals would just migrate to a different part of the continent where the climate and habitat was more favorable to them. And we can see this as paleontologists, we see things like this happening all the time in the deeper time record. But of course today they can't, right? Because the continent is bisected by roads and cities and poachers and farmers who don't want their crops trampled and stuff. And so the only way some of these large mammal populations are going to survive is if humans actually put them in trucks and move them physically to a new protected area. So that's an example of what we call a synergy, where you have two intersecting pressures creating a worse extinction pressure than either one of them or even the two of them added together. It's like a multiplicative effect. Now, some colleagues and I have long argued that in order to really understand what happened during this last significant extinction event, and in a way that's actually useful for kind of understanding extinction processes and potentially using those lessons to mitigate the biodiversity crisis we're in today, what we really need to do is take this more nuanced approach and not be like, oh, well, this is clearly either humans or climate, but not both, right? Like we really need to get at a more granular, sort of high-resolution understanding of this extinction. So why haven't we done this? Well, the problem is that this extinction happened very rapidly, and during a time of these two processes that are very significant, but very closely tied in time. And the fossil record, it turns out, is just not well sampled enough for people to have anything more than this really sort of big picture fuzzy understanding of the timing of the extinction. So for instance, in a database we recently compiled of all reliable radiocarbon dates on large mammals in North America, there's the vast majority of them are represented by fewer than 5 dates for an entire species for the entire continent, and many of them have only a couple. So there's only 5 species with more than like 15 dates on them for the entire continent of North America, outside of one site. And that site is the La Brea tar pits. Now, the tar pits are, how many people have been to the tar pits? Oh, good. That's good. That makes me happy. So we were recently named one of the first 100 global geoheritage sites, and that's because we have the richest paleontological record for a terrestrial ecosystem anywhere in the world, by at least an order of magnitude. There it is, there we are. And this is about what it looked like in the Ice Age. And since this isn't like a geology group, I was just gonna, I have this little video made that explains how the tar pits got here. As we heard earlier, a lot of people come to our site and leave not even knowing that it's a real site. Many people who come and understand that it's real still don't know why it's there, how the site formed. So this is just a little video we have.
The La Brea Tar Pits and Museum is the world-famous home to millions of Ice Age fossils,
Sorry, I didn't check.
animals,
Okay.
and plants that were trapped in the tar over the past 50,000 years. The stuff oozing out of the ground in the La Brea Tar Pits is actually asphalt, a low-grade crude oil. To understand how it got here, we have to travel back in time 20 million years to the formation of the Los Angeles Basin. The Pacific Plate and North American Plate share a boundary called the San Andreas Fault. It's pretty famous, perhaps you've heard of it. The Pacific Plate started its northwest motion about 20 million years ago, stretching out parts of the western continental crust like pizza dough. One of those stretched out areas became the Los Angeles Basin, a bowl-shaped geologic feature that stretches from the San Gabriel Mountains in the east to Palos Verdes in the west. The basin was filled with ocean water and marine life, including tiny microorganisms called diatoms, a type of algae with a glass-like silicate shell. Over millions of years, diatoms died and sank to the basin floor. Seismic activity continued to shape the basin, and sediments piled up, pushing the bottom of the basin down, a process known as subsidence. Sedimentary layers rich in diatoms were pushed deeper and deeper under the weight, and the pressure of the overlying sediment created the perfect conditions to heat up the organic matter and convert it into oil. This perfect range of temperatures is called an oil window. California is famous for its earthquakes. In addition to the San Andreas Fault, there are also many smaller cracks and fissures, like the 6th Street Fault, which runs right through, you guessed it, 6th Street, which is right next to, you guessed it, the La Brea Tar Pits. Seismic activity allowed the oil to leak its way up to the surface through cracks in the ground, creating thin asphaltic seeps. Plants and animals started getting trapped in the asphalt about 50,000 years ago. They've continued getting stuck ever since. Which brings us to today, where excavators and scientists work together to explore the jumbled up remains of these asphalt-rich fossil deposits. To learn more, visit the La Brea Tar Pits and Museum or go to tarpits.org.
Anyway, that's the little 2-minute synopsis of why we have the tar pits, why they're here in LA. Los Angeles Basin is actually the richest oil basin by unit volume in the world. That means we have more oil per cubic meter than like Saudi Arabia or Texas or Anwar or any of these other places. There's a ton of oil here, and if you see any historic photos of the area, you'll know it's like all oil derricks everywhere, including right around the tar pits. So this phenomenon where we have these sticky seeps of crude oil working their way up along fractures to the surface and making these shallow pools has managed to trap more than 5 million fossils that we've excavated so far, representing about 600 species of plants and animals across the last 55,000 years. So that's just a phenomenal opportunity that we have to do all kinds of research on ecosystems and climate change and extinction and adaptation. But today what we're going to focus on really is these large mammal fossils. So this photo was taken in 1915. And so the Natural History Museum of LA was founded in 1913, and for the first 2 years, they ran extensive excavations at the La Brea tar pits. They excavated more than 1 million fossils during that time. Almost all of those fossils were large mammal bones. They didn't really care about the plants or the insects or the lizards at that time. They were really focused on these big extinct mammals, which means we have just a phenomenal collection of really well-preserved fossil bones of these large extinct Pleistocene mammals. And so recently, thanks to an NSF grant, we were able to run radiocarbon dates on several hundred of these fossils. Now, one thing about the asphalt is it preserves the original biotic material. So these aren't specimens that have become mineralized where the bone tissue or plant tissue has been replaced by other minerals in the environment. It's still the original biotic tissue, which means we can get precise radiocarbon dates off of almost everything. We can also run stable isotopes, so we can look at proxies for diet and environment and other things like that. We've tried and tried and tried to get DNA. We haven't been successful in that yet, but there's a lot of amazing research we can do because we have that original bone material. And one of those, and the thing that I work most closely on, is radiocarbon dating and figuring out how old it is. So we got about 550 new radiocarbon dates on 8 species of animals from the tar pits. So we have American lion, saber-toothed cat, direwolves, and those little guys over there, the coyotes, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. We still see them around today. And for herbivores, we have horses, bison, camels, and paramylodon ground sloths. And what we discovered in the course of this study was that one of the asphalt seeps at the tar pits, and it's one that you can see if you go walk around the park. It's pit 6167. It's the biggest seep that is surrounded by a fence. Not the lake in front, that's not a tar pit. That's an 19th century commercial asphalt mine that filled in with water. It's pretend, so that part is pretend. The people who come here, they're not wrong about that. But the other seeps in the park are real, and pit 6167, which is still active today, it's got bubbles in it, that seep was active when the extinction occurred. And we know that because when we dated these 8 animals in that pit, at one point, the camels and horses and bison and lions and saber-toothed cats, they all stop, and all that's left is coyote, 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 coyote. So we know that the seep was still active, it was still trapping animals, but the only large mammal left to trap were the coyotes. And so that was this amazing aha moment that we found. And something else that was interesting was, with the exception of the camels and possibly the sloths, which we don't have as many dates on, camels disappear a little earlier. All the rest of the species go out at exactly the same time, which was really interesting. Now, for several of these are actually, most of these are the youngest known direct dates on any of these species in North America. That being said, you all saw the slide like 3 slides ago that said we hardly have any dates on stuff in North America, so take that with a grain of salt. So something else we did is we did something called a sum probability distribution. Many of you are probably familiar with this. It's used in archaeological analyses a lot as well, but basically looking at kind of the density of dates to look not just at when the last thing was, but what was kind of the population dynamic over time, or in this case, like, how frequently were different things getting trapped across time. And then we compared this with that North American data set I showed you before. And it's interesting because everything at the tar pits is gone by 13,000 years ago or 12,900 years ago, which is like before the start of the Younger Dryas, that cold snap. But there are later dates on some things, especially sloths and proboscideans, elsewhere in North America. So that's the subject of a new project I'm working on. I'm happy to talk about that later. But it's interesting because we seem to see a different pattern in Southern California than we maybe do on the continent as a whole. We also looked at what was going on with individual species. As I said, the camels kind of disappear earlier. Now, camels, the extinct Ice Age camels here are actually, they're not desert adapted, they're actually associated more with forested environments. They were browsers, which means they weren't eating grass, they were eating like shrubs and tree leaves and wood, and they disappear earlier, and they're sort of replaced proportionally by horses in the record. The other thing that's interesting is that we see sort of this like gradual decline. The decline is actually starting here, even though there's sort of this precipitous disappearance right at 12,900, 13,000. The decline actually starts a few thousand years earlier, around 14,700. So now that we knew when the extinction happened, we could go about starting to understand the potential causes. And so, of course, now we need to go out and gather data on these two potential culprits, the climate and the people. So archaeological data, as I'm sure most of you are aware, it's pretty scarce for this time period in Southern California. That being said, the oldest human skeleton in North America was found on Santa Rosa Island, just offshore from Santa Barbara. That's Arlington Springs. And that's dated to exactly 13,000 years, so exactly the same time that we see the last appearance of these animals. So that's very interesting. And of course, we have earlier evidence of humans in Western North America. We have Paisley Caves up in Oregon, which has human coprolates, confidently dated to about 14,500 years ago. And then, of course, 2 years ago, the White Sands, New Mexico site was published, purporting that humans may have been here as early as, more than 20,000 years ago. So that's very interesting. And I understand it's not published yet, but I understand that there are potentially older dates on Santa Rosa Island as well now. And then, so we wanted to know, so that's, sort of general evidence that like humans existed, but like how many, what were they doing? We wanted a little more detail on that. And so we took the Canadian Archaeological Radiocarbon Database and ran another SPD where we looked at density of dated archaeological sites for North America, southern Canada through to the Mexican border, basically, is what we're looking at. And what we see is that humans are here. They're here at but then, so there's a few consistent number of archaeological sites that are dated, at this time, starting at least 15,000 years ago. But right here, where we see the extinction event, there's a significant increase in in dated archaeological sites, which we're using as a proxy for human population density in North America. So that's very interesting. Now, the other thing we needed, of course, was to know what's going on with climate, and specifically, how is the climate impacting the environment locally. Now, unfortunately, Southern California doesn't have a lot of great paleoclimate records. We have some offshore sites that have been drilled, but there are different things going on with currents and stuff that make it a little hard to extrapolate. So this is the best terrestrial site we have. It's Lake Elsinore, which is, I don't know, 60, 80 miles southeast of here. And there's a really great core record from there. And there are teams, including some researchers here at UCLA, that have done a lot of analysis on this core and have managed to find, to learn a lot about what was going on in sort of coastal mainland Southern California during this interval of interest. So one thing is, of course, they analyzed the pollen, and this was largely done by Glenn McDonald's lab. He's a professor in the geography department here. And what they found, this is just like a very simplistic analysis that we did of the data, but basically, so starting about 16,000 years ago, this area, so the last glacial maximum, the last point where like the most ice was covering North America was around 20,000 years ago. It started melting, and by about 15,000 years ago, it's starting to get warmer and drier here. And as it's getting warmer and drier, we're losing trees. So we start to see a decrease in tree pollen relative to other things like grasses. Sarah Feekins' lab over at USC also used these chemical compounds, branched glycerol, dialkyl glycerol tetrathers from bacterial membrane lipids, that's a proxy for air temperature. And what they found is that there's this very significant increase in air temperature. In fact, air temperature rose about 10 degrees Celsius over the last couple thousand years. There was a 5 degrees Celsius temperature rise in a 1,000-year period. That's incredibly rapid. It's only about a tenth of the rate of temperature rise we're seeing today, but it's still incredibly impactful for ecosystems. Matt Kirby's lab down at San Jose State, maybe? No. Anyway, he's around here in Southern California. They also looked at percent sand in the record, which is a proxy for precipitation. So the more sand you have, that means like the more water you have running off into the lake. So you see a gradual decline in precipitation across this time. And then the last thing is Lisa Martinez, who's a grad student in Glenn McDonald's lab here at UCLA. For her master's thesis, she ran the charcoal from that. And I've never thought much about charcoal. I've never thought much about fire. It was sort of like, oh, that's interesting. I don't really, it never occurred to me. And then we saw this, and I have completely changed my tune, because this is just astonishing change in fire regime that we see at this time. So here's the story that we were able to put together with all these data. So starting around, at least 15,000 years ago, probably much earlier, the site at La Brea Tar Pits looked probably something like this. It's an oak juniper woodland. You've got some grassy areas punctuating these stands of trees. We have high abundance of many different species of megafauna. We have permanent slow running streams. We know this because we find like fossils of rainbow trout at our site, which can only live in permanent slow moving streams. And everything's sort of good. And it's been like this probably for, thousands of years. But then around 14,700 years ago, something happens. So this is when those deglacial climate changes are starting to impact our region. We see temperatures are starting to rise, precipitation is starting to decline, we're losing our tree species, and we see the beginning of a decline in herbivore populations at La Brea and a concurrent decline in carnivore populations. We also see droughts starting to happen. So we have periods of droughts that are lasting for decades where we're not seeing runoff into the lake, and we're seeing other evidence of lack of precipitation in the record. And here's where we have 5.5 degrees Celsius of climate warming in a pretty short span of time. That's a lot. And then at 13,300 years ago, something changes. We enter a 300-year-long megadrought. This is, of course, at the same time that we see that increase in human populations. The megafauna populations crash to zero, and this all happens during a time when suddenly this record that has had little to no evidence of fire, charcoal in the record, suddenly charcoal is hugely present. There's massive change in the fire regime, massive increase in fire right here. And when you come out of these fires, fires start to go back down. They never go back down to where they were before, like up until about 13,300 years ago. You never go back to that Pleistocene level of fire. But once you come out of it, the megafauna are gone. You're in this open grassland ecosystem with very few trees. You've got lots of Asteraceae, like sunflowers, like plants in that family. This is when the chaparral evolves. I'll get to that in a moment. And this is all before the Younger Dryas begins. So this is even before that cold reversal that people have thought might be implicated in the extinction of the megafauna. We're in the Holocene before that, from an ecosystem perspective. And then the thing about the fire-adapted vegetation, this is really important, and I think it's really important for anthropologists and archaeologists in particular. Because we always think, and also for conservation biologists, we always think about like the chaparral as sort of like the native, you know, California ecosystem, right? Like this is our natural ecosystem, and the way that conservation biologists for decades have thought about conserving nature is that the best way to conserve nature is to keep people out of it. But this chaparral did not exist before people were here. It only came into existence when humans showed up. And so I think that's something that's really important to think about when we are talking about conserving natural ecosystems to support biodiversity. And so what we see, we did some quantitative modeling of this. And what we see, we think, is a classic kind of ecosystem state shift happening in California at this time. And we think that the catalyst for this state shift is either the arrival or significant increase in human populations on the landscape. And the reason we think this, there are a few reasons. So fundamentally we think there was an ecosystem that was predisposed to fire. Why? Because it was getting hotter, it was getting drier, you had large-scale droughts, you had declining herbivore populations, so you're starting to get this buildup of fuel load. But there wasn't an ignition source until humans showed up. And here's why we think that. So first of all, this was the first thing that gave us an idea, is we did some econometric modeling. This is a type of analysis. It's used in economics, it's used in like counterterrorism, it's used in all kinds of random things. I've never seen it used in ecology before, but if you're basically looking at time series of data and you're trying to figure out, okay, does a change in one phenomenon predict a change in one of the other phenomena at a later point in time? And we got a lot of kind of reasonable results, like, you know, changing plant communities impacts the fire, changing herbivore communities impacts the carnivore communities, et cetera. But the biggest result we got, the biggest effect size, was change in humans. So increase in humans positively increases fire by a lot. And we thought, well, that's weird. Like, we'd never really, why would we be getting that result? So we dug into it a little more. So here's another evidence of this. So the fire activity, it goes back down, but it remains high even when you go back into this cooler, wetter period known as the Younger Dryas. You still have an elevated amount of fire in the system. But the real clincher is that this record, what we analyzed was, or what we published in the paper was this much. The rest of it's part of Lisa's thesis, so she's going to do a detailed analysis of, or publication of the full record. But the record actually goes back more than 30,000 years, 33,000 years. For the first 20,000 years of this record, there is little to no fire happening in this core. In fact, even during times of similar warming and drying. So there's a megadrought here about 30,000 years ago, 30 to 28,000 years ago. It lasts for 2,000 years. There's barely any increase in fire. The only time you see the increase in fire is when you have a drought and warming climate that coincides with humans on the landscape. And why is this? It's because here in Southern California, we don't have natural ignition sources. We have very, very few lightning strike caused fires. Even today, with all of the efforts we make to mitigate human-caused fires, 95% of the wildfires in coastal Southern California are caused by humans. Downed power lines, vehicles, arson, campfires, gender reveal parties, right? Like, it's all human-caused fires. And of course we see this, even like despite our best efforts, this is exactly what we see happening today, is this intersection of climate change and human activities are leading us into a new stage, which people have even given a name, the Pleistocene, right? Like, we're entering this stage of fire. And it's not caused by one thing, it's caused by two things that are happening at the same time. Because we've been, you know, for the last at least 13,000 years here in Southern California, we've been in sort of a stable fire state. Now, we had human management of fire during much of that time, we know, and there's probably a reason for that. So the depression of that sort of learned management of fire that was being practiced by people in the area for thousands of years certainly impacts this as well, but so does the changing climate. And then, because this is an anthropology group, I wanted to kind of come around to this question about the Anthropocene. There's a lot of talk in the paleontological community about, this as well. My former advisors in the Anthropocene working group, they've sort of settled on, as of this year, 1950 as the baseline for the start of the Anthropocene, being a geological epoch that can be seen and will be able to be seen far into the future in geological records. And what they're using is the initiation of atomic testing as one of the geological markers that you can see around the world. But there have long been arguments by people that maybe we should be looking further back in time. So there are people that argue that the Industrial Revolution is actually when humans start transforming the landscape and the atmosphere and Earth's climate on such a scale that that should be really marked as its own epoch. There are scientists who say, no, it's actually when the Europeans first come to the Americas, and suddenly there's this homogenization in plants and animals across the globe. But also, I was shocked when I read this. I didn't know. European arrival led to the deaths of about 50 million indigenous people in the Americas, most within a few decades of the 16th century, mostly due to smallpox. The resulting near cessation of farming across South America and regrowth of the forests like Amazonia and other vegetation removed enough carbon dioxide from the atmosphere to produce a pronounced dip in carbon dioxide in the Antarctic ice core records. I had no idea that that event had caused a marked change in the geoclimate that could be seen in records. That was shocking to me. Going back, other people say maybe the beginning of agriculture is when the Anthropocene started, because that was, obviously a huge onset of transformation of Earth's landscapes by humans. Or then, you could take data like what I've presented today and say, well, maybe actually it happened at the end of the Pleistocene with the extinction of these large animals, which is, again, probably the onset of this ongoing biodiversity event, which Rudolfo Durzup at Stanford refers to as the rodentification of ecosystems, where you're going from, having things weighing many thousands of pounds being the biggest things in ecosystems, to things weighing hundreds of pounds, to things weighing maybe a few tens of pounds, down to things weighing less than 10 pounds being the biggest things you see in global ecosystems, again, in a very rapid period of time relative to Earth history. So to sum up, evidence from research done just down the street here, as well as many collaborators across Southern California, leads us to suggest that maybe we should start reframing how we're thinking about extinctions, and especially this particular extinction event that started not that long ago, but has profoundly impacted the Cenozoic ecosystems of planet Earth. So first of all, I think all ecosystems really need to be looked at on a regional scale. That's the relevant ecological unit over which they are occurring. And so if you really want to understand the processes of extinction, you really need to understand what it's doing in particular regions with their own particular ecological and human communities. Most extinctions are complex and involve multiple intersecting causes. Climate change and human actions can intersect to drive ecological tipping points. That's a warning. And this extinction event that happened very recently probably offers the best opportunity to understand on a mechanistic level how extinctions happen. And and our hope now is to start building on this to understand, okay, well, here's our story for this region, what's happening in neighboring regions, what's happening in other parts of North America, and how do all those dominoes fall down. So that's what we're working on now. This, of course, was a big story. We were very excited. They made the cover of Science, even though nobody gets paper publications anymore. It was still exciting. And so now we're working on some kind of trying to resolve this event for particular taxa in other regions of North America, as well as ongoing work I've been doing in South America. And yeah, this is sort of the big questions, like how do extirpations progress across continents to drive extinctions? So this is a bunch of our working group. We have collaborators all over Southern California and all over the country, and we're very happy to share it with you, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts. So thank you very much. Question?
Yeah, thanks for the talk. There's a lot of discourse in public and scientific spheres in Southern California about fire regimes being natural, and right, that there's a general recognition, it seems to be, that humans cause most of the fires that we're saying, but then there's also all of these discussions about how we should properly maintain ecosystems, and that periodic fires are necessary or an adaptive part of the ecosystem in order to make things healthy. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that, and if this research sort of adds any nuances to that.
Yeah, thank you. So it depends on the ecosystem, right? Like this pattern, so the reason, some concerns I had in publishing this paper were people were going to be like, okay, we solved the Pleistocene extinctions, like everybody move on, right? This is not going to be the story in a region that has regular lightning, right? Like bringing humans as an ignition source into a system that already has a regular ignition source, that's going to be a different story of how animal species are impacted and when and which species in that region, right? But there are a lot of regions, and I've been going into this recently with some work I'm doing in South America. There are a number of regions where like humans show up and there's this flip in the fire regime, right? So like the tropical Andes, we have a couple of lake core records in Peru that, humans appear, like suddenly you go from like no fire to fire at the same time as the extinction, but there's also positive feedbacks, right? Because remember, those declining herbivore populations are also impacting the fire regime. So it's very complex, and you really need well-resolved records where you can look at not just timing, but like dynamics, changes in population, along with climate records in order to understand how it all goes together. It's complicated. But yes, I think there's also, we've had, in other parts of the West, there's been sort of a stable fire, or like regular, predictable fire regime. And then we hit a climate tipping point, and the rate and magnitude of fires in, I think, the like Montana area, like doubled overnight, and it had to do with like how many days over a certain temperature were you getting in a summer, right? So there's a paper by Westerling out of UC Merced that came out maybe in 2016 or so. So like there's things that are all climate, there's things that are like very human, there's things that have to do with what fauna are living there or aren't living there or are being removed or being brought in. And then there are places where those processes are coming together. But I do think you really have to recognize kind of the complexity and that like different, it's going to be region dependent, right? And I think, again, one of the like huge kind of mind-blowing things for me out of this paper was this recognition that like the fire-adapted chaparral flora, right, that assembled after humans brought fire into the region. It didn't exist before fire, and fire didn't really exist before humans brought it, right? And so, and we know, obviously, that indigenous populations in the area were managing with fire. And according to their oral histories, they've been managing with fire for thousands of years. And this is probably true. Like we see that elevated fire. People probably figured out pretty quickly, oh, we need to like burn this regularly. Because you can't, like chaparral is, you can't hike in it, you can't hunt in it, right? Like it's gonna catch on fire in a big way if you don't do anything about it, right? But that's a human-created ecosystem, and yet it was pretty stable for like thousands of years. Like we can see, after this big collapse or ecosystem state shift, you enter this new regime, and it stays pretty stable for 10,000+ years, and then, you know, the Europeans show up, they halt the burning, but then it's still sort of stable, right? Like since, I don't know, the early 1900s, like people have been living here, but then we get to a point where there's this buildup and then there's the climate change, right? And then the climate change is now making it harder and harder and harder to suppress those fires. Yes?
This is very fascinating. Even just a different view of the tar pit, you know, very underappreciated as a scientific resource, I think.
Yeah, we've got a lot of stuff if anyone wants to come down and do some research. Just
And this is my question. Given what you've shown about humans and fire, is the increased population the main factor in increased fires? And then do fires reduce the population so that we'll then have decreased fires?
You're talking about now or then?
I'm talking about now.
Oh, now.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, we've certainly had increased fires around the world in the last at least 10 years.
for sure. Well, and that's a lot of that is due to climate, I think, has been well documented. But again, climate is making ecosystems that are more likely to burn. But in this ecosystem, and I think in a lot of other ecosystems, the actual ignition source is people, right? Because if you have an ecosystem where you're getting regular lightning anyway, like, well, that's also going to be impacted by climate change, but it probably has a different evolved plant community, you know, that evolved over 10,000, if not more, years within the context of that system. Whereas, you know, the plants that have been here all this time, like, it's very hard to keep them from burning. And I mean, you see it, like, there's tons of effort to prevent humans from setting wildfires, and there's tons of firefighting infrastructure and technology that we have now, and we still, every summer and fall, we have smoky air, we have people being evacuated, we have property loss, we have humans' lives lost, right? It's a really intractable solution. And yes, certainly people choosing to live at the wilderness wildland urban interface is making humans more vulnerable to fires and is creating another opportunity for ignition. Yes?
Thanks so much, really interesting talk. I was wondering if you had any thoughts about what is at stake between the two possible accounts of the increase in human population, like migration and arrival versus just increase of existing populations that existed there. Because I know, based on the data you showed, that like distribution, there was some evidence of human, you know, like presence in the LA basin, and then you see this massive increase, and you were kind of agnostic as to one or the other account. But do you see like there being differential stakes to one story versus the other?
Not for me. You know, I don't know about for archaeologists. I'm sure people, you know, have careers staked on these sorts of questions. I think the evidence is humans were probably here, because when we model human sort of population expansion, we're highly adaptable, we're very smart, we're social, like, and we see that in the archaeological record. Once humans show up somewhere, like, they're everywhere, right? Like, you get a site somewhere on a continent, and within a couple of decades, like, there are sites everywhere. My question, you know, what I'm curious about is sort of how are these three things intersecting, right? So you have human population growth, you have megafauna decline, and you have climate change. And each of those has some relative contribution to this tipping point, right? And so you have pressure, pressure, pressure from one thing, pressure, pressure from another thing, and then you hit that tipping point. So I don't think it's that humans suddenly showed up 13,000 years ago and everything caught on fire. I think that we have lots of evidence that humans were probably here quite a bit earlier. And again, there's these positive feedbacks, right? Like reduced megafauna makes more fires, kicks out the megafauna, right? But the same thing, I wonder, as you're losing these large mammals, does that actually positively benefit humans in some way? Like, I would not be here if there were giant lions walking around, like, forget it, or packs of saber-toothed cats, like, no way, right? And so, but like, once they're gone, hey, this is a pretty great place to live. Now, 2008, my graduate advisor published a paper where he just sort of ran back of the envelope calculations looking at total large mammal biomass for several 100,000 years on a global scale, right? And what he finds is that as you get sort of a decline, so you have sort of this concurrent decline in megafauna populations and increase in human populations, but there's kind of this carrying capacity that you see. So you see, like, there's a certain amount of total biomass taken up by large mammals on the planet, and it doesn't really change that much until you hit the Industrial Revolution. And then it goes up. And there's a reasonable explanation for this, which is that, like, we get a certain amount of light from the sun every year. We have a certain amount of primary productivity, and that can support a certain amount of, like, large-bodied animals. Used to be dinosaurs, now we're the large-bodied animals, right? And really, and so for a long time, it was big mammals, for tens of millions of years, big mammals, right? And then the big mammals were like us and our domesticates, cows, sheep, goats, right? But the total biomass stayed about the same until we start burning stored sunlight. And then we're increasing our primary productivity because we're taking sunlight that accumulated over thousands or millions of years and burning it in 1 year and getting all that energy all at once. And then we're able to increase the carrying capacity of planet Earth for large things. Now, that's a problem when we run out of that stored sunlight, right? And we don't have a way to replace it. But I just think it's very interesting. You know, it's very kind of loose calculations and stuff, but it's interesting intellectually to think about it that way. Yes?
Do you understand why the megafauna was more susceptible to extinction than smaller animals?
So scientists who have worked on this have mostly concluded that it has to do with reproductive rate and your ability to respond to change. So if you have like a lot of babies a couple times a year, like it's you can adapt pretty quickly. You know, you can respond to big environmental upheavals or other types of upheavals pretty quickly. If you're a mammoth, mammoths are very closely related to elephants. The gestation period for an elephant is about 2 years, right? So if you're producing one offspring every 2 years, small perturbations can really impact your population, right? And there's, you know, when people talk about human hunting being the causal factor in these extinctions, you know, there's sort of this image people have of like, oh, well, small bands of humans couldn't have like run out and killed all the megafauna all at once, but you don't have to do that, right? Like you just have to kill slightly more than are being born every year, right? So let's say you have a population of, you know, 1,000 mammoths and maybe 10% of them are reproducing every year, right? So that's, you're maybe having 100 mammoths born a year, you kill 120 a year, it's not gonna take long. People have modeled this. It doesn't take long for that population to crash. Does that answer your question? Yeah.
You're saying more the life cycle.
Yeah.
Than the size of the animal.
Yeah, exactly. But body size is very tightly correlated with reproductive.
So we can continue this conversation in 5 minutes. We're gonna take a quick little break.
Okay.
And you can drink some water, people can help themselves with some coffee.